They arrested him for existing where existence was forbidden. Elias Vance, 68 years hardened into sinew and shadow, felt the cold metal bite his wrists as officers dragged him from the park bench that had become his surveillance post. The desk sergeant laughed when he requested his one phone call to the Attorney General. Minutes later, that same sergeant went pale as the private line rang, a voice demanding immediate release. The homeless man arrested for trespassing walked out free, but Sacramento had no idea that its streets still held secrets worth bleeding for, and Elias Vance was far from finished bleeding. The morning Elias Vance was arrested began like every morning for the past 11 months, cold, deliberate, and wrapped in the particular kind of silence that comes from being professionally invisible. He had positioned himself on the same weathered bench in Riverside Park at dawn, his body arranged in the careful sprawl of someone society had taught itself not to see. His coat, a patchwork of donated fabric and strategic stains, smelled of rain and old coffee grounds, scents he had cultivated with the same precision he once used to build cover identities in foreign cities where discovery meant a bullet in the back of the head. The park was waking slowly around him, joggers appearing like clockwork at 6:15, their expensive shoes slapping pavement in rhythms he had long ago memorized. He watched them through half-closed eyes, his peripheral vision cataloguing faces, gaits, the small tells that separated routine from reconnaissance. The bench beneath him had become more than a place to sleep. It was an observation post, a fortress of assumed helplessness that granted him access to patterns no badge or warrant could reveal. The sun climbed with reluctant grace through Sacramento's morning haze, painting the park's fountain in shades of amber and rust. Elias shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache in his left hip, where a knife had found home in Belgrade, 23 years ago in a life that officially never existed. His fingers, gnarled and permanently stained beneath the theatrical dirt he applied each evening, traced the edge of a newspaper he had pulled from a recycling bin. The headline spoke of budget cuts and political theatre, but his eyes were trained on the southeastern corner of the park, where the children's playground met a service entrance most visitors never noticed. 3 times this week, a white panel van had idled there between 2 and 3 in the morning, its driver exchanging brief words with figures that emerged from the shadows like smoke taking temporary form. Elias had photographed each encounter with a camera hidden inside a hollowed-out thermos, his hands steady despite the cold that made his joints scream protest. The playground equipment stood silent in the morning light, swings swaying empty, but he could still see the chalk marks on the pavement, symbols that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't speak the particular language of human commerce. The first indication of trouble came not from the police, but from the pigeons. Elias had been feeding them for months, not out of sentiment but strategy. Their patterns of flight and congregation provided early warning of unusual movement in the park's ecosystem. This morning, they scattered wrong, too early and too frantically, before any joggers approached his section of the path. He felt his spine straighten instinctively, decades of training overriding the character he wore like a second skin. 2 uniformed officers were approaching from the western entrance, their walk purposeful rather than patrol casual, and behind them a man in a suit that cost more than Elias's monthly operational budget gestured toward the bench where he sat. The private security guard from the neighboring corporate complex, he realized. Someone had finally complained about the homeless man who refused to move along, whose presence was deemed incompatible with the carefully curated aesthetic of gentrified Sacramento. Elias felt something ancient and cold settle in his chest, not fear, but a kind of weary recognition that his cover, so painstakingly constructed, was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Sir, this is private property." The first officer's voice carried the exhausted authority of someone who had delivered this speech 1,000 times to 1,000 forgotten faces. Elias looked up slowly, making sure his eyes were appropriately unfocused, his posture defeated rather than defiant. He had played this role in 9 different countries, had perfected the art of becoming nothing worth remembering, but something in the second officer's stance made his instincts flare. This one was young, eager, hand resting too comfortably on his belt near the handcuffs, looking for an excuse to escalate rather than de-escalate. The security guard stood 10 feet back, arms crossed, satisfaction radiating from his pressed uniform and polished shoes. Behind them, the park continued its morning routine. A woman pushed a stroller past without looking, earbuds sealing her in a private world, while a man in running gear checked his watch and frowned at the delay in his precisely timed loop. None of them saw what Elias saw in this moment, the fragile machinery of his investigation grinding toward catastrophic exposure because someone had decided his presence offended their sense of order. "I'm not causing trouble," Elias said, his voice roughened by months of careful vocal strain, pitched to sound broken rather than controlled. "Just trying to stay warm. I'll move along." He made to stand, a show of compliance designed to diffuse, but the young officer stepped forward with an energy that spoke of quotas and ambition rather than necessity. His hand was already reaching for the cuffs, his partner's expression shifting from tired routine to uneasy concern. The security guard smiled, a small victory of property rights over human dignity, and Elias understood with perfect clarity that he was about to be arrested not for what he had done, but for what he represented. Poverty as aesthetic violation, suffering as inconvenience. His mind raced through contingencies, weighing the damage of maintaining cover against the risk of revealing capability. The white van would return tonight, possibly with cargo too precious to lose, while he sat in a holding cell explaining his presence to officers who would never believe the truth. 11 months of surveillance, of cold nights and calculated degradation, of building a map of one of the West Coast's most sophisticated trafficking networks. All of it balanced on the edge of this moment where a young cop's need to assert authority met an old spy's need to remain invisible. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a sound that echoed through decades of memory, other arrests, other countries, other times when steel had tested his ability to maintain character while his mind screamed strategy. Elias let his shoulders slump, let his body language radiate defeat and confusion, but inside his chest, his heart beat with the cold precision of a man who knew exactly what came next. The officers guided him toward their cruiser, their grip firm but not cruel, while early morning Sacramento flowed around them like water around stone, indifferent to one more homeless man being swept from view. The park bench sat empty behind him, still warm from his body heat, a newspaper fluttering in the breeze beside the thermos that held 11 months of evidence no one knew existed. As they loaded him into the back seat, Elias caught one last glimpse of the southeastern corner, the service entrance, where tonight shadows would gather and exchange would occur. And he made the calculation every deep cover operative eventually faces. When invisibility fails, revelation becomes the only weapon left. The cruiser pulled away from Riverside Park, carrying a man the world saw as nothing toward a confrontation that would prove some things, once valued, can never truly be erased. The holding cell at Sacramento Central Station smelled of industrial cleaner and human desperation, a combination Elias Vance recognized from facilities spanning 3 continents and 4 decades of classified service. They had processed him with the mechanical efficiency reserved for society's disposable, fingerprints taken, pockets emptied of their carefully curated collection of receipts and bottle caps. His name entered into a system that would flag nothing because the man he had been was buried under layers of official amnesia. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man whose name tag read Morrison, had handled him with the particular brand of disdain reserved for repeat offenders of existence. his thick fingers jabbing at keyboard keys while Elias stood in the requisite position of institutional submission. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with the frequency of migraine, and somewhere down the corridor a voice was shouting about rights and lawyers, the sound bouncing off concrete walls that had absorbed decades of similar protests. Elias remained silent, his eyes downcast but his mind cataloguing every detail, the shift change schedule visible on a wallboard, the blind spot in the corner camera's coverage, the way Morrison's wedding ring had worn a groove into his finger from 20 years of the same circular motion. They placed him in a holding cell with two other men, neither of whom looked at him with anything resembling interest. One sat against the far wall, young and strung too tight, his leg bouncing with the rhythm of withdrawal or anxiety, while the other sprawled on the bench with the resigned patience of someone for whom jail was less punishment than routine. Elias lowered himself onto the concrete floor near the barred door, his joints protesting the movement, but his positioning strategic. From here, he could observe the entire corridor, track the movement of officers and detainees, monitor the flow of information that pulsed through every police station, like blood through living tissue. The young man's legs stopped bouncing and started again, a metronome of private misery, while the veteran of the system snored softly, his breath whistling through broken teeth. Time moved differently in holding cells. Elias knew. Seconds stretched into geological eras, while hours collapsed into instants, the distortion playing tricks on perception that could be weaponized by those who understood the psychology of confinement. He had spent 6 weeks in a Russian detention facility once, maintaining cover as a Finnish businessman, while his actual target was interrogated 3 cells away, and he had learned then that patience was not the absence of action, but its most refined form. An hour passed, or perhaps 3. The lack of windows and consistent lighting made precision difficult, before Morrison appeared at the cell door with a clipboard and the expression of someone fulfilling bureaucratic obligation rather than judicial duty. "Vance," he called, his voice carrying the nasal quality of someone who had given up on enunciation years ago. "You get your phone call. Make it quick." The other 2 occupants of the cell didn't stir, lost in their private negotiations with circumstance. But Elias rose with the careful slowness of age and performance, shuffling toward the door with the gait he had perfected over months of street-level surveillance. Morrison led him down the corridor to a wall-mounted phone that had seen better decades, its receiver scarred by years of desperate conversations and broken promises. The sergeant gestured toward it with barely concealed impatience, already halfway back to his desk, where coffee steamed next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. 1 call, 5 minutes, no conference lines. The rules delivered in the monotone of infinite repetition, words that had been spoken to thousands of people, who all became the same person in the eyes of institutional processing. Elias lifted the receiver, its weight familiar in his palm, despite the years since he had needed to make a call like this. His fingers, hidden from Morrison's line of sight, traced the numbers with the precision of muscle memory, undimmed by time or circumstance. Not the public line any citizen might dial, but a routing that would connect through 3 different switchboards before reaching a phone that sat on a specific desk in Washington, D.C. He could feel Morrison's attention waning, the sergeant's focus already back on his crossword, and knew that the next 60 seconds would either vindicate 11 months of calculated suffering or expose him as delusional, a homeless man whose mind had fractured under the weight of streets and solitude. The line clicked, hummed, clicked again, and then a voice answered, professional, female, trained to screen calls with ruthless efficiency. Attorney General's office. The words crisp as winter air, no patience for rambling or confusion. Elias felt the decades collapse in his throat, felt the weight of every identity he had ever worn pressing against his ribs, and spoke in a voice that was neither the homeless man's rasp nor his own forgotten register, but something between, the voice of someone calling in a debt that transcended normal channels of power. "This is Elias Vance, authorization code November 7 Alpha 3 Echo. I need to speak with the Attorney General. Now." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Morrison to look up from his crossword, his pen pausing mid-letter, a frown beginning to crease his broad forehead. The woman on the other end of the line said nothing for 3 heartbeats, and Elias could imagine her checking databases, running verification protocols, her training warring with the impossibility of a call routed from a police station in Sacramento, carrying authentication codes that were decades old but still active in systems most people didn't know existed. Then her voice returned, subtly different, the bureaucratic shield replaced by something harder and more alert. "Please hold." No questions, no explanations, just the professional recognition that some calls transcended normal protocol. Morrison was fully attentive now, his bulk shifting in the chair, his eyes narrowing as he tried to reconcile the homeless man he had processed with the tone of voice coming from the receiver. The hold music was Mozart, Elias noted with grim amusement. Symphony No. 40 in G minor. The same piece that had played in a safe house in Prague when he had first met a young prosecutor named David Chen, who had asked too many smart questions about a case involving international money laundering and diplomatic immunity. 37 seconds later, Elias counted them with the internal clock that had been calibrated through hundreds of operations. The line clicked and a voice replaced Mozart. A voice that had aged 3 decades, but retained the fundamental timbre of intelligence and carefully controlled intensity. "Elias?" One word, not quite a question, carrying the weight of years and memories and a relationship that existed in the blank spaces of official records. Morrison was standing now, his crossword forgotten, his expression cycling through confusion toward something like alarm, as he recognized that the conversation happening at his wall phone was wildly outside the parameters of normal holding cell protocol. Elias turned his back slightly, not enough to seem furtive, but enough to claim a fragment of privacy, and let himself smile, small, cold, the expression of a man whose gambit had just paid off in the only way that mattered. "Hello, David," he said quietly, using the first name that no one outside of classified briefings would know the Attorney General possessed a connection to. "I'm afraid I need you to make a phone call to the Sacramento Police Department. I seem to have been arrested for trespassing, and it's interfering with my work." The words simple, almost casual, but behind them 11 months of infiltration and investigation, and behind that the accumulated weight of a career spent in shadows that suddenly, brilliantly, had found a way to cast light exactly where it was needed most. The desk sergeant's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical under different circumstances. Color draining from his cheeks as if someone had opened a valve, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish discovering air for the first time. Elias held the phone loosely, his posture unchanged. Still the broken old man arrested for the crime of occupying space, but his eyes tracked Morrison's every movement with the attention of a predator who had just reminded the world that age did not erase capability. On the other end of the line, Attorney General David Chen's voice carried layers of emotion that professional discipline couldn't quite contain. Surprise, certainly, but beneath that something warmer and more complex, the recognition of a debt that had shaped the trajectory of his entire career. "Where exactly are you, Elias? Give me the details." No skepticism, no demand for proof, just immediate tactical assessment, the same quality that had made Chen valuable 3 decades ago when he was a mid-level prosecutor, willing to listen to a deep-cover agent's intelligence about corruption that reached into the highest levels of California's political infrastructure. Elias provided the information crisply, his voice shedding its theatrical roughness like a snake releasing dead skin. words emerging with the precision of someone accustomed to briefing rooms and classified communications. Morrison had backed away from his desk, his hand moving unconsciously toward the phone on his own desk, as if seeking confirmation that reality had not entirely fractured. While other officers in the station began to notice the unusual tableau, the homeless man speaking into the wall phone with unexpected authority, the desk sergeant pale and unsettled, the atmosphere in the room shifting like air pressure before a storm. Elias could feel the weight of attention gathering, knew that he had approximately 90 seconds before someone with more rank arrived to assess the situation, and used the time to provide Chen with the minimum essential details. 11 months undercover, human trafficking investigation, Riverside Park as a key surveillance location, the arrest threatening operational security. He spoke in the compressed language of people who had worked together when stakes were measured in lives rather than careers, each word carefully chosen to convey maximum information in minimum time. Chen listened without interruption, and Elias could imagine him in his Washington office, probably in shirt sleeves, despite the early hour on the East Coast. His mind already working through the implications and necessary protocols to extract an old friend from a situation that was simultaneously absurd and deadly serious. "I'm going to call them now," Chen said, and there was something in his voice beyond professional courtesy, a kind of fierce loyalty that reminded Elias why he had trusted this man decades ago, when trust was the currency that could purchase either salvation or a quiet burial in foreign soil. "Stay on the line if you can. If they disconnect you, cooperate fully. They're going to be confused, probably upset, but they'll follow orders once I explain the situation. Elias." The pause stretched long enough for Morrison to take another step backward, bumping into his desk and sending coffee sloshing over crossword ink. "It's good to know you're still working," I thought. The sentence unfinished, but Elias understood its shape. Chen had thought him dead or retired or broken by the accumulated weight of a career spent in darkness. The assumption was reasonable, even statistically probable, but Elias had never been particularly interested in probability when purpose remained unfinished. "The work isn't done, David. It's never done. Make your call." He hung up before Chen could respond, the receiver settling back into its cradle with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent station. Morrison stood frozen, his training warring with instinct, while Elias turned to face him with an expression that was neither threatening nor supplicating, but something entirely other, the look of someone who had just reminded the universe of obligations it had tried to forget. "Sergeant Morrison," Elias said quietly, his voice still carrying traces of the rasp he had cultivated, but underneath it something harder and more refined. "In approximately 2 minutes, your station's private line is going to ring. The call will be from the United States Attorney General's office. They will have specific instructions regarding my immediate release and a request for departmental discretion regarding this incident. I would appreciate if you would answer that call promptly and follow those instructions without delay. Time is a factor in ways I cannot fully explain, but which I assure you matter considerably." The words delivered without arrogance, simple statement of fact from someone accustomed to operational necessity, overriding normal procedure. Morrison's mouth opened, closed, opened again, his hand finally finding his desk phone as if seeking anchor in familiar protocol. Around them, the station had gone quiet in the particular way that precedes either violence or revelation, officers pausing mid-action to observe the impossible scene of a homeless arrestee issuing instructions to a desk sergeant who looked like he had just glimpsed the edge of a universe much larger and stranger than his training had prepared him to navigate. The private line rang. Morrison stared at it for 3 full rings, his hand hovering as if the receiver might burn his palm before his training overrode paralysis, and he lifted it to his ear. "Sacramento Central Station, Sergeant Morrison." His voice wavered slightly, professionalism struggling against the surreal nature of a morning that had departed entirely from expected patterns. Elias watched Morrison's face as the voice on the other end spoke, saw the color drain completely before flooding back in, watched his eyes widen and then narrow and then widen again, as information was delivered that contradicted every assumption built into the interaction between police authority and homeless vagrancy. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but Morrison aged years in that span, his understanding of hierarchy and power receiving an education that no training manual could provide. When he hung up, his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the key ring at his belt, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a quality Elias had heard before in other contexts, the tone of someone who had just brushed against machinery of state that operated far beyond their normal sphere of awareness and influence. "Mr. Vance," Morrison said, and the addition of honorific was telling, "I've been instructed to release you immediately with a full apology for any inconvenience. Your possessions will be returned, and there will be no record of this arrest in any official database." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes meeting Elias's for the first time with something approaching respect, mixed with unease. "I've also been instructed to provide you with any assistance you might require and to ensure complete discretion regarding this incident." The Attorney General was very clear on both points. Around them, the station remained frozen, officers watching with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning realization that they had just witnessed the collapse of assumed categories. The homeless as powerless, the arrested as culpable, the system as simple hierarchy rather than complex web of hidden obligations and forgotten debts. Elias nodded once, the gesture minimal but acknowledgement enough, and allowed Morrison to escort him toward the processing desk where his belongings waited in a plastic bag marked with a case number that would now never appear in any official record. The morning had shifted entirely, and as he walked through the station that had held him, Elias felt the familiar weight of operational reality settling back around his shoulders. The work was not done, the network still operated, and now he had perhaps 12 hours before word of his arrest and release filtered through channels that would make his position in Riverside Park untenable. The clock was running, and Sacramento's streets held secrets that would not keep themselves. They returned his possessions with hands that shook slightly, Morrison's thick fingers handling the plastic bag as if it contained evidence of something dangerous rather than the accumulated detritus of calculated poverty. Elias checked the contents methodically. The hollowed thermos with its hidden camera, $3 in carefully crumpled bills, the newspaper with margin notes that would look like rambling but were actually surveillance logs, a plastic lighter that had never held fluid, and the small notebook whose pages contained drawings that appeared to be confused sketches but were actually coded maps of trafficking routes throughout Sacramento's hidden infrastructure. Everything present, everything intact. But the very fact of the inventory revealed how close he had come to catastrophic compromise. If Morrison had been more curious, if some junior officer had examined the thermos more carefully, if anyone had actually looked at the notebook's pages with trained eyes rather than dismissive glance, 11 months of work would have evaporated into evidence bags and investigative protocols that would have alerted every player in the network he was tracking. The margin between maintained cover and total exposure had been measured in millimeters of attention, and Elias felt the familiar cold satisfaction of having survived another statistical improbability through combination of preparation and carefully cultivated assumptions about how society viewed its forgotten members. Morrison escorted him to the station's front entrance personally, an unprecedented courtesy that spoke volumes about the content of that phone call from Washington. The sergeant's face had settled into an expression of wary respect, his earlier disdain replaced by the uncertainty of someone who had just learned that the world contained layers his experience had never prepared him to navigate. "Mr. Vance," he said, as they reached the glass doors that separated the station from Sacramento's morning traffic, his voice low enough that other officers couldn't hear. "I don't know what you're involved in, and I've been told very clearly that I shouldn't ask. But I want to apologize for how you were treated this morning. If there's anything the department can do to assist your work, please don't hesitate to contact me directly." He produced a business card from his pocket, plain white with black text, nothing that would draw attention, and pressed it into Elias's palm with the urgency of someone making amends for an offense they were only beginning to understand. Elias accepted the card, his expression softening slightly. Morrison was decent beneath the cynicism, shaped by a system that taught him to view suffering as administrative category rather than human condition, and the crack in that conditioning was as close to redemption as institutional training usually permitted. The morning air hit Elias's face like a baptism of cold clarity. Sacramento's streets already warming under sun that had climbed past its early amber into the harsh white of approaching afternoon. He had lost approximately 4 hours to the arrest and processing, time he could not recover but might be able to compensate for if he moved quickly and thought carefully about the new terrain his situation had created. His cover was damaged but perhaps not destroyed. Homeless men did occasionally get released from custody without charges, the system's occasional mercy or bureaucratic error, and the other regulars in Riverside Park might accept a story about mistaken identity or a cop with a grudge. But the trafficking network would be more suspicious. Their security protocols built on paranoia that was both professional and justified, and any deviation from established pattern might trigger precautions that would render his surveillance position worthless. Elias walked away from the police station with the shuffling gait he had perfected, his shoulders rounded in the posture of defeat, but his mind was racing through contingencies and calculations, weighing the operational cost of his morning's exposure against the intelligence he had already gathered and the critical window of opportunity that remained before the network shifted its patterns in response to the instincts that kept successful criminals alive. 3 blocks from the station, Elias ducked into a public library branch that had just opened its doors, the institutional warmth and smell of old books providing temporary sanctuary where he could think without the immediate pressure of street observation. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes and tired smile, nodded at him without surprise. He had been here before during his months of surveillance, using the computers and restrooms, one more homeless patron seeking refuge in one of the few public spaces that still offered dignity without demanding payment. He made his way to the back corner, where a row of older computers sat beneath windows that looked out on an alley, and settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, logging into an email account that existed in no name he had ever used, checking for messages in a dead drop that only 3 people on Earth knew existed. 2 messages waited. One from a contact in the Sacramento District Attorney's office, flagged with the code that meant routine update, nothing urgent, and one from a number he didn't recognize, carrying the subject line that made his chest tighten, with combination of anticipation and dread. Package ready for delivery. Location confirmed. Timeline, tonight. The message itself was brief, written in the kind of bland language that would look like spam to anyone who didn't understand the code buried in seemingly random character strings. But Elias had been reading such messages for 40 years, and the intelligence they contained was both vindication and crisis. The trafficking network was moving a shipment tonight, high-value cargo that the coded message suggested included minors, using the Riverside Park Service entrance as a staging point before transport to a secondary location that Elias's informant had finally identified after months of careful observation and strategic relationship building within the network's lower tiers. The shipment would happen between 2 and 4 in the morning, the same window when the white van had appeared on previous occasions, and it represented exactly the kind of actionable intelligence that could justify 11 months of cold nights and calculated degradation. But it also represented a timeline that gave him less than 14 hours to return to his position, re-establish his cover despite the morning's arrest, and maintain surveillance in a location where his presence might now draw exactly the kind of attention that would compromise everything. Elias stared at the screen, his reflection ghostly in the monitor's surface, and felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions pressing against his ribs. The choice between safety and completion, between walking away from a year's work and risking exposure that could cost lives beyond his own. He deleted the messages using protocols designed to ensure no trace remained, then cleared the browser history and cache with the thoroughness of someone who assumed surveillance was constant rather than occasional. The library's warmth seemed insufficient suddenly, the familiar comfort replaced by the cold calculation of operational necessity. Elias rose from the computer station and made his way back to the entrance, pausing only to nod thanks to the librarian who had never asked his name or his story, who had simply allowed him existence in her space without demanding justification or payment. Outside, Sacramento's streets continued their daily rhythms, traffic flowing in patterns that would repeat tomorrow and the day after, the city's vast indifference providing the camouflage that had always been Elias's most reliable weapon. He turned toward Riverside Park, toward the bench that had been his post and fortress, and felt the decades of his life converging on this single point. One more night, one more operation, one more chance to prove that the work mattered even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching was. The homeless man, arrested for trespassing, was walking back into danger with eyes wide open and purpose undimmed, and somewhere in Washington, an attorney general was probably wondering if the call he had just made would result in another classified folder marked with dates of service and final disposition, another ghost added to the legion of those who served in shadows and were buried in silence. Riverside Park looked different through the lens of compromised security. Its familiar contours now waited with the knowledge that he had been removed and returned, that the seamless fabric of his cover had been torn and hastily mended in ways that might show under sufficient scrutiny. Elias approached his usual bench with the same shuffling gait, the same defeated slouch, but his awareness was heightened to the point of pain, every sense tuned to detect observation or anomaly in the park's afternoon ecology. The joggers were different at this hour, a new rotation of bodies and routines, but the essential patterns remained. People passed without looking, their eyes sliding over him with the practiced indifference of urban dwellers who had learned that acknowledgement invited complication. He lowered himself onto the bench with theatrical slowness, his joints protesting genuinely now after hours of holding tension in concrete cells and walking streets with purpose hidden beneath performance. The thermos came out of his coat pocket, positioned on the bench beside him in the exact angle that allowed its hidden camera to capture the southeastern corner where tonight's delivery would occur. If the intelligence was accurate and the network hadn't shifted protocols in response to instincts Elias couldn't yet measure. An hour passed in the peculiar compression of surveillance time, where seconds stretched and minutes collapsed, depending on the density of relevant activity. Elias maintained his character perfectly. Occasional shuffling adjustment of position, a pause to examine the newspaper, whose margins now contained fresh observations about foot traffic and vehicle patterns, the careful rationing of attention that made him appear absorbed in private misery rather than professional observation. But beneath the performance, his mind was working through probability matrices and contingency chains, calculating the likelihood that his arrest had already propagated through the network's communication channels, weighing the risk that watchers were even now assessing whether his return to position represented genuine vagrancy or something more purposeful and dangerous. The park's fountain continued its endless cycle, water arcing through afternoon sun in rainbows that children chased with squealing delight. Their innocence a sharp counterpoint to the knowledge Elias carried about what moved through these same spaces, after darkness made all shapes equally indistinct. He thought about those children, about the ones whose pictures filled folders in offices he would never visit, about the calculus that made some lives searchable and grievable while others disappeared into networks that profited from society's deliberate blindness. The white van appeared at 3:15, 7 hours earlier than its usual arrival window, and Elias felt his spine stiffen before conscious thought could process the implication. It idled at the southeastern corner for less than a minute, no exchange visible, no figures emerging from shadows, just a slow scan of the park's perimeter before pulling away with deliberate casualness that was itself a tell. They were checking, verifying, confirming that the location remained viable or assessing whether something had changed in the operational environment. Elias forced his body to remain still, fought the instinct to track the vehicle's departure too obviously, maintained the posture of someone whose attention was captured by nothing more pressing than the next hour's survival. But his internal alarms were screaming analysis, his experience reading the language of professional caution that separated routine from reconnaissance. They were nervous or curious or both, and the timing of their appearance, so soon after his arrest and release, suggested that information had flowed through channels faster than he had hoped, that someone had noticed something or been told something that made tonight's planned delivery suddenly uncertain or potentially compromised. The question was whether they would proceed despite uncertainty or abort and reschedule, and Elias had no way to predict which instinct would prevail in operational minds he had never directly observed. As afternoon bled into evening, and the park began its transition from family space to twilight territory where different rules applied, Elias noticed the watchers. 3 of them, positioned with the kind of casual spacing that would look random to untrained eyes, but formed perfect overlapping fields of observation for anyone who understood how surveillance teams deployed in urban terrain. 2 men and a woman, none of them obviously homeless, but all of them performing variations of belonging. One reading on a bench, one walking a small dog in repetitive loops. One standing near the fountain with phone raised as if capturing photos, but the angle wrong for genuine tourism. They were good, better than street-level security. Their movements coordinated with the kind of discipline that came from training or extensive experience. Elias felt cold understanding settle in his chest. The network had noticed his arrest, or more precisely, had noticed the pattern break when he disappeared for 4 hours and then returned, and they were running their own counter-surveillance to determine whether he represented threat or coincidence. The plan for tonight was already compromised, he realized with bitter clarity. Not catastrophically, but sufficiently that proceeding would be measured risk rather than calculated certainty. And he had perhaps 3 hours to decide whether exposure served the mission better than continued concealment. The woman with the phone moved first, her circuit bringing her within 20 feet of Elias's bench, close enough that he could see her eyes flick toward him with assessment that lasted a fraction of a second before returning to her phone screen. She was younger than he had initially assessed. Late 20s, perhaps, with the kind of controlled physicality that suggested capability held in deliberate reserve. Her shoes were wrong for the character she was playing, too practical, too sturdy. The footwear of someone who might need to run or fight rather than stroll through parks taking photographs of fountains. Elias let his gaze drift past her without apparent focus, maintaining the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose attention was consumed by internal navigation rather than external observation. But he catalogued every detail with the precision of decades spent reading threat in gesture and posture. She completed her pass and returned to a position near the playground equipment, her phone still raised, but her body language shifting subtly from documentation to communication. She was reporting, Elias understood, feeding information back to someone who was making decisions about tonight's operation, based on assessments that included whether the homeless man on the bench represented acceptable risk or unacceptable variable in an equation where margins of safety were measured in years of freedom versus decades of imprisonment. The sun descended toward the horizon with the slow inevitability of planetary mechanics, painting the park in shades of amber and shadow that transformed familiar geometry into something more ambiguous and uncertain. The joggers disappeared, replaced by dog walkers and couples holding hands, the park's population shifting as the day released its claim and evening established its different sovereignty. Elias remained on his bench, a fixture so constant that he had become part of the landscape's furniture. But he could feel the weight of observation pressing against him from three directions, the surveillance team maintaining their positions with patience that spoke of professional discipline. The question that burned in his mind was whether they recognized him specifically as threat or were simply running standard security protocols, checking for law enforcement presence or rival network surveillance that might compromise their operation. His arrest this morning had been visible, documented, the kind of event that would generate reports and potentially flag attention from any organization monitoring police activity in their operational territory. But his release had been equally visible, unexplained and irregular, the kind of anomaly that in the world of criminal enterprise could mean informant or undercover operative as easily as bureaucratic error or sympathetic intervention. At 7:30, as darkness completed its conquest of the park and the streetlights flickered to life in their programmed sequence, the watchers withdrew. First the man with the dog, collecting his animal and walking toward the western entrance with the finality of someone whose shift had ended. Then the reader, closing his book and stretching with theatrical exaggeration before ambling away toward downtown's lights. Finally the woman, her phone lowered at last, her path taking her past Elias's bench one final time, close enough that he caught the scent of her perfume, something expensive and subtle, incongruous with the casual clothes she wore. Her eyes met his for less than a second, and in that fragment of connection, Elias saw something that made his breath catch. Not hostility or suspicion, but a kind of cold assessment that was almost respect, the recognition of one professional observing another and filing the data for future reference. Then she was past, disappearing into the gathering dark, and Elias was alone on his bench, with the fountain's endless song and the knowledge that whatever happened tonight, his position was burned beyond any possibility of recovery. The network knew he existed, knew he was watching, and proceeding with the operation would be either supreme confidence or elaborate trap designed to identify and eliminate whoever had been paying attention to their movements. The hours between 8 and midnight stretched with the particular quality of pre-operational tension, every minute weighted with possibility and dread. Elias maintained his position through cold that settled into his bones and made his old injuries sing their familiar chorus of protest. The park emptied gradually, the last dog walkers retreating to warm homes and safe beds until only the true homeless remained. Scattered shadows on distant benches, humans who had become part of the city's nocturnal landscape through necessity rather than strategy. Elias recognized 3 of them from his months of observation, knew their patterns and territories, the invisible boundaries that separated survival space from conflict zone. None of them approached his corner, respecting the distance that street culture understood even when official society could not. He thought about his phone call this morning, about David Chen's voice carrying decades of shared history and mutual obligation, and wondered if that call had been the right choice or fatal error. the decision point where operational necessity had collided with personal connection and produced outcomes he could not yet fully assess. The thermos sat beside him, its camera recording empty darkness and patient stillness, evidence of nothing except the passage of time in a park where children played by day and other transactions occurred when daylight's witness had withdrawn. At 1:47 in the morning, the white van returned. It approached without headlights, rolling through the park's service entrance with the confidence of vehicles that had every right to be there. And Elias felt his heart rate spike despite decades of training in physiological control. This was the moment, the convergence of 11 months of observation toward whatever would happen in the next crucial minutes. The van stopped near the service entrance, engine idling with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the night stillness, and Elias's hand moved to the thermos with casual slowness, adjusting its angle by millimeters to ensure the camera captured whatever would emerge from either vehicle or shadows. Two figures exited the van's front seats. Men, both wearing dark clothing that absorbed the streetlight's glow, their movements economical and purposeful. They stood beside the vehicle, scanning the park with visible wariness, and Elias could read in their body language the heightened alertness that came from perceived threat or compromised security. They were proceeding despite uncertainty, he realized, either because the delivery was too valuable to postpone, or because they had assessed the risk and deemed it acceptable within parameters Elias could only guess. The question that would determine everything was what emerged from the van's rear doors. What cargo justified this operation and validated 11 months of his life spent in cold and degradation. The rear doors opened, and Elias felt something break open in his chest. Not surprise, but a kind of terrible confirmation that was worse than surprise, because it carried the weight of expected horror finally manifesting in physical reality. 4 figures emerged from the van's interior, small and uncertain. Children whose ages Elias estimated between 8 and 14, their movements sluggish in ways that suggested chemical assistance in keeping them compliant and silent. They stood in a tight cluster, held together by fear more effectively than any physical restraint, while the 2 men gestured them toward the service entrance, where a door had opened to reveal a third figure whose face remained shadowed, but whose posture suggested authority and expectation. Elias watched through eyes that had seen variations of this scene in 7 different countries, watched children being moved like inventory through the machinery of commerce that operated in every society's margins, and felt the cold fury that had sustained him through 4 decades of classified service burning with renewed intensity in his chest. He needed to move, needed to act, but operational discipline held him frozen on his bench because premature action would scatter the network like roaches under sudden light. Would save these 4, perhaps, but leave the infrastructure intact to harvest others whose suffering would occur beyond reach of intervention or justice. The transfer took less than 3 minutes, the children guided through the service entrance with efficiency that spoke of practiced routine, the door closing behind them with finality that made Elias's hands clench involuntarily. The 2 men returned to the van, one of them pulling out a phone and speaking briefly into it, his voice too low to carry across the distance, but his gestures indicating report or confirmation. Then they were back in the vehicle, pulling away from the service entrance with the same careful casualness, headlights activating only after they had cleared the park's perimeter and rejoined the city's normal traffic flow. Elias remained motionless on his bench, the thermos beside him recording everything, evidence that would be meaningless without the supporting infrastructure of investigation and prosecution, without the machinery of justice that required more than one old man's surveillance to overcome the network's lawyers and politicians and carefully constructed shields of plausible deniability. He had what he needed now: visual documentation of the delivery, confirmation of the location's use, the faces of at least 3 members of the trafficking organization captured on camera. But the cost of obtaining that evidence was 4 children disappearing into a building whose interior he had never penetrated, whose purpose he could only infer from intelligence gathered over months of patient observation and strategic cultivation of sources, who spoke in whispers and shadows. The hours between the van's departure and dawn's first light passed in a fog of operational planning and suppressed emotion that Elias had learned long ago to compartmentalize but never truly overcome. He remained on his bench as the park slowly emerged from darkness. The thermos returned to his pocket with its cargo of documented horror, his mind racing through the protocols that would need to be activated to transform surveillance into action. The children's faces haunted the space behind his eyes, 4 individuals whose names he didn't know, whose stories were mysteries he might never learn, but whose existence had just been documented in ways that could either save them or become evidence at trials that would occur years after damage had already calcified into permanent scarring. Elias had spent his career balancing these impossible equations, weighing the immediate against the systemic, calculating whether saving one meant losing 10 or stopping 10 meant failing to save the one. And the mathematics never became easier despite decades of practice in cold assessment. The sun rose with indifferent beauty, painting the fountain in shades of rose and gold, and the park began its transformation back into family space, where the previous night's transactions existed only as invisible history recorded in a device the size of a coffee thermos. At 6:30, when the first joggers appeared like clockwork mechanisms resuming their programmed patterns, Elias rose from his bench with genuine stiffness that required no performance. His body ached in ways that reminded him of his 68 years, the cold having settled into joints and muscles with the insistence of age asserting its claims despite will or necessity. He shuffled toward the park's eastern exit, away from his usual routes, choosing a path that would take him past the service entrance where children had disappeared 7 hours ago. In daylight, the door looked entirely ordinary, grey metal, unmarked except for a number painted in faded black, indistinguishable from 1,000 other service entrances throughout Sacramento's commercial districts. But Elias had learned decades ago that evil rarely announced itself with obvious signage, that horror often wore the face of absolute mundanity, and the building behind that door held secrets that would require more than one man's observations to expose. He memorized the address, the building's architectural details, the sight lines and access points that would matter when tactical teams eventually moved in, if they moved in. If the evidence he carried proved sufficient to overcome the legal barriers that protected networks with resources and institutional patience. 3 blocks from the park, Elias entered a small coffee shop that had just opened its doors, the smell of brewing espresso and baking pastries a reminder of normalcy that felt almost obscene after the night's events. The owner, a man named Marcus, who had served him coffee during his months of surveillance, nodded recognition without surprise or judgment, pouring a large black coffee without being asked and sliding it across the counter with a gentle smile. "Rough night?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual concern that required no detailed response, and Elias nodded, accepting the coffee and the small kindness it represented. He found a corner booth with sightlines to both the entrance and the street beyond the windows, and pulled out the hollowed thermos with hands that had finally stopped shaking from cold and adrenaline. The camera inside was sophisticated technology, disguised in battered plastic, the kind of equipment that cost more than most people earned in months, but looked like something rescued from a recycling bin. Elias extracted the memory card with practiced efficiency, replacing it with a fresh one in movements too quick for casual observation to catch, then slipped the recorded card into a hidden pocket sewn into his coat's lining months ago in preparation for exactly this moment. The coffee shop's Wi-Fi was password protected, but Elias had the code, Another small kindness Marcus had extended without asking questions about why a homeless man needed internet access. He pulled out a battered smartphone that looked like it had survived multiple drops and water damage, its cracked screen held together with clear tape. But the device beneath the theatrical deterioration was actually high-end hardware running encrypted operating systems that existed in no commercial marketplace. His fingers moved across the screen with precision that belied their apparent stiffness, accessing secure networks and initiating upload protocols that would route the video evidence through a series of anonymizing servers before depositing it in a digital dead drop that 3 different agencies could access with proper authorization. The upload took 11 minutes, during which Elias forced himself to drink the coffee and maintain the appearance of someone resting rather than someone transmitting evidence that could trigger investigations spanning multiple states and federal jurisdictions. When the progress bar reached completion, he initiated a secondary protocol that would send encrypted notifications to contacts whose names existed in no official roster, prosecutors he had worked with over decades, federal agents whose careers had intersected with his own in operations that remained classified, and David Chen, whose morning was about to be disrupted by information that would require immediate attention and careful political navigation. The messages sent, Elias allowed himself a moment of exhaustion that was entirely genuine, the weight of the night finally settling onto shoulders that had carried similar burdens for 40 years. He thought about the children, about where they were now, and what was happening to them in spaces he couldn't reach, and felt the familiar rage that had sustained him through operations in places whose names he couldn't speak, mixed with the helplessness that came from understanding system limitations. The evidence he had gathered was crucial but not sufficient. It would require corroboration, warrant applications, tactical planning, coordination between agencies that often competed rather than cooperated, and all of that would take time measured in days or weeks, while those children existed in circumstances that consumed innocence by the hour. Elias had learned long ago that justice was not immediate, that the machinery of law moved with deliberate slowness, designed to protect rights and ensure accuracy. But that slowness created gaps where horror flourished, and victims accumulated damage that no eventual prosecution could repair. The coffee in his hands had gone cold, but he drank it anyway, the bitter taste appropriate to the moment, while Sacramento's morning traffic flowed past the windows, and the city went about its business utterly unaware that evidence of its hidden predation was now propagating through networks designed to transform observation into action. At 8:15, Elias's phone vibrated with an incoming message. Brief, coded, confirming receipt of the uploaded evidence and initiating response protocols that would bring resources to bear on the location he had identified. The message came from a number he recognized as belonging to the Sacramento field office of an agency whose acronym most citizens could name, but whose actual operations remained largely invisible. The text was deliberately vague, meaningless to anyone intercepting it, but Elias understood its implications. Within hours, there would be surveillance teams establishing positions around the building, analysts reviewing the video footage and cross-referencing faces against databases of known traffickers, prosecutors drafting warrant applications that would need to survive judicial scrutiny designed to protect constitutional rights, even when those rights were being weaponized to shield monsters. The machinery was in motion, vast and imperfect, powerful and frustratingly slow, but motion nonetheless, and Elias felt the particular satisfaction that came from successfully translating observation into action, even if the action itself would unfold beyond his direct participation or control. His role was ending. The homeless man, who had occupied Riverside Park's bench for 11 months, about to disappear as completely as he had appeared, leaving behind only questions for those who had noticed him and evidence for those equipped to use it. He finished his coffee and rose from the booth, leaving bills on the counter that were clean and crisp rather than crumpled, a small departure from character that Marcus would perhaps notice or perhaps not, the kind of detail that would become just another mystery in a city full of unexplained moments and forgotten faces. Elias walked toward the door, his gait still shuffling, but his spine fractionally straighter, the weight of his mission shifting from active surveillance to documented completion. Outside, Sacramento was fully awake, traffic and pedestrians flowing in their daily patterns, the vast indifference of urban life providing the same camouflage it always had. He turned away from Riverside Park, away from the bench that had been his home and fortress for almost a year, and walked toward a future that was uncertain in its specifics, but familiar in its essential shape. He would disappear again, into another identity or another city, find another network that needed mapping or another horror that required witness, because the work was never finished and retirement was a luxury he had never been able to afford. The homeless man arrested for trespassing had become the invisible operative once more, carrying evidence that would save some and haunt him with all those it wouldn't, walking Sacramento's streets one last time before vanishing into the vast machinery of a war most people didn't know was being fought in the spaces between their comfortable assumptions about how society functioned and what happened in its shadows. The safe house was in Stockton, 40 miles north of Sacramento, a nondescript apartment in a complex designed for temporary corporate housing, where occupants came and went with such frequency that no one noticed one more unremarkable tenant. Elias had maintained the location for 3 years, using it as a way station between operations and a place where he could temporarily shed the various identities he wore, like seasonal clothing. The apartment was sparsely furnished, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a series of locked cabinets whose contents would have interested federal authorities if they knew to look. But it represented the closest thing to stability in a life built entirely around instability and strategic rootlessness. He arrived in early afternoon, having taken a series of public buses whose routes he had memorized months ago, watching for surveillance with attention that never entirely diminished, even when the immediate threat had passed. The apartment smelled of disuse and air conditioning, neutral and forgettable, and Elias felt his body begin to release the tension of 11 months spent maintaining character without break or private respite. He showered for the first time in weeks, the hot water sluicing away layers of theatrical grime and genuine exhaustion, revealing skin that was weathered but intact, the body of a man who had abused it professionally but maintained its essential functionality through discipline and necessity. Clean and dressed in clothes that fit properly, rather than the layers of donated fabric he had worn for months, Elias looked in the mirror and saw a stranger who was actually his truest self. Weathered face lined with decades of careful observation, grey hair cut short in a style that suggested military background without advertising it, eyes that carried the particular quality of alertness that never quite faded, even in moments of rest. He made coffee in the apartment's small kitchen, the ritual familiar and grounding, then settled at the table with a laptop that he pulled from one of the locked cabinets. The device powered up with encrypted protocols that required biometric authentication and password combinations that existed nowhere in written form, accessing networks that operated parallel to normal internet infrastructure. Messages waited, more than he had expected, indicating that the evidence he had uploaded 12 hours ago had already propagated through investigative channels and triggered responses at multiple organizational levels. The first message was from David Chen's office, formal and carefully worded, thanking him for his service and requesting a full debriefing at his earliest convenience. The language bureaucratic, but carrying undertones that suggested personal concern wrapped in professional obligation. The second message was from the Sacramento field office, more detailed and operational, outlining the response that was being mobilized around the building Elias had identified. They had established surveillance within 2 hours of receiving his evidence, the message explained, and had confirmed ongoing activity at the location that corroborated his intelligence. Multiple vehicles had been observed coming and going, and thermal imaging suggested significant occupancy despite the building's officially vacant status. A tactical operation was being planned for 72 hours from now, pending final warrant approvals and coordination with local law enforcement. The timeline, driven by legal requirements and the need to build a case that would survive aggressive defense strategies. 72 hours, Elias thought with cold clarity. 3 days during which those children would remain in captivity. 3 days during which the network could potentially detect increased surveillance and move their assets to new locations. 3 days that represented the gap between knowing and acting, that defined the difference between intelligence work and fantasy. He understood the necessity. Rushing in without proper legal authority could compromise prosecutions, and rushing in without adequate tactical planning could endanger hostages. But understanding didn't make the waiting easier or the calculations less brutal. The third message was from a source Elias didn't immediately recognize, a number that wasn't in his contacts, but used authentication codes that indicated legitimacy within the network of people who did work that existed in classified files and sealed records. The message was brief: secondary location identified, your evidence cross-referenced with ongoing investigation, coordination needed. Meet. The implication was clear. Elias's 11 months of surveillance had intersected with someone else's operation, providing a piece of a larger puzzle that was being assembled by investigators he had never met, who were tracking networks that extended far beyond Sacramento's boundaries. This was how the work actually functioned, he knew from decades of experience. Not lone operators solving cases in dramatic flourishes, but vast machines of investigation slowly accumulating evidence across time and geography, building cases that required years of patient documentation and strategic coordination. His contribution was significant, but not singular, important, but not sufficient, one thread in a tapestry that others were weaving toward outcomes he might never fully witness. The idea of meeting with an unknown operative raised immediate security concerns, but the authentication codes were legitimate, and the potential for coordination outweighed the risks of isolation. Elias sent a brief reply, agreeing to meet at a location he specified, a public park in Stockton, afternoon tomorrow, a space where surveillance would be difficult and approach routes easily monitored. The afternoon faded into evening while Elias reviewed the other messages and compiled his operational notes into a formal report that would exist only in encrypted form on servers whose locations he couldn't specify. The report was detailed and precise. 11 months of observations condensed into structured intelligence that analysts and prosecutors could use to build understanding of the network's operations. He included descriptions of the surveillance team that had watched him in Riverside Park, details about the van's repeated appearances and the patterns of activity around the service entrance, assessments of the organization's security protocols, and behavioral patterns that suggested their level of professionalism and resources. The writing was clinical and unemotional, stripping away the personal cost of the operation to present only actionable intelligence. But beneath the professional language, Elias felt the accumulated weight of what he had witnessed and what he had been powerless to prevent during the long months of observation that preceded action. Every intelligence operative lived with this particular burden, the knowledge that came before the ability to act, the watching that preceded the stopping, the documentation that was necessary but insufficient while suffering continued in real time. At 9 that evening, David Chen called on a secured line that bypassed normal telecommunications infrastructure. His voice carried fatigue that matched Elias's own, the weariness of men who had spent careers in battles that received no public recognition and left casualties that no one counted officially. "Elias," Chen said, and the use of first name without preamble indicated the conversation was personal rather than professional. friend speaking to friend rather than Attorney General speaking to asset. I've reviewed your evidence. It's extraordinary work, but I'm concerned about you. 11 months on the street at your age, the physical toll alone. He trailed off, leaving the concern unspoken but clear. Elias smiled slightly, appreciating the sentiment, even as he recognized its futility. Concern was kind, but changed nothing about choices already made or costs already paid. The work required it, David. The network is sophisticated and paranoid, and any conventional surveillance would have been detected immediately. The homeless are invisible in ways that serve operational necessity, even if the personal cost is high. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, stating reality without seeking sympathy or validation. Chen was silent for a moment, and Elias could imagine him in his Washington office, probably working late as he always had, surrounded by the machinery of power, but still remembering the young prosecutor who had once listened to a deep-cover agent's impossible story and chosen to believe. The tactical operation is scheduled for 72 hours from now, Chen continued, shifting back to professional ground. I've been briefed on the planning, and they're taking your intelligence seriously. Multiple agencies are coordinating, which is both good and complicated. Good because it brings resources, complicated because it requires political navigation. There are jurisdiction questions, questions about how the evidence was obtained, concerns about your status as an operative without current official authorization. The last point hung in the air between them, the elephant in the room that they both had been avoiding. Elias had been conducting an unauthorized operation, acting on his own initiative without agency backing or legal cover, operating in a grey zone that offered no protection if things went wrong. His arrest this morning had highlighted that vulnerability, and Chen's intervention had been personal rather than official, a favor called in rather than duty fulfilled. I'm prepared to testify if necessary, Elias said quietly, to explain the operation's parameters and justify the methods. The evidence is clean and the intelligence is accurate. If there are legal complications, I'll absorb them rather than compromise the prosecution. Chen sighed, the sound carrying decades of friendship and mutual respect. I know you would, but I'm working to ensure that doesn't become necessary. You've given us enough, Elias, more than enough. It's time to let the machinery take over and for you to step back. The words were gentle but firm, the concern of someone who understood that knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to start. But Elias felt the familiar resistance rise in his chest. Stepping back meant trusting others to finish what he had begun, and trust was a commodity his career had taught him to ration carefully. They spoke for another 20 minutes, discussing operational details and legal strategies, Chen explaining the political complexities of coordinating between federal and state agencies, and Elias providing additional context about the network's structure and vulnerabilities. When the call ended, Elias sat in the apartment's artificial light, feeling the particular loneliness that came after intense operations ended and the adrenaline faded, leaving only the awareness of time passed and costs accumulated. 68 years old, he thought, looking at his hands that had held weapons and cameras and coffee cups offered by kind strangers, hands that had built legends and broken covers and maintained positions through cold that made bones ache. How many more operations did he have in him? How many more identities could he wear before the essential self became too fragmented to recover? The questions were familiar, recurring at the end of every assignment, and he had never found answers that satisfied for more than the time it took to hear about the next network or the next horror that required someone willing to do work that existed in shadows. Outside, Stockton's night sounds filtered through the apartment's walls. Traffic and distant sirens, the ambient noise of a city that never fully slept. And Elias listened to it with the attention of someone who had spent so long being invisible that visibility felt like a kind of nakedness, exposure without the armor of assumed identity to protect the vulnerable truth of who he actually was beneath all the carefully constructed fictions. The meeting in Stockton's Oak Park occurred under afternoon sun that made shadows sharp and observation angles clear, exactly the conditions Elias had chosen for their tactical advantages. He arrived 30 minutes early, positioning himself on a bench that offered sightlines to all approaches, while appearing to be nothing more than an older man reading a newspaper. The park was moderately populated, parents with children, a few joggers, teenagers gathered near a basketball court. Enough activity to provide camouflage, but not so much that surveillance would be impossible to detect. At precisely 2 o'clock, a woman approached his bench, walking with the controlled casualness of someone who understood operational security, but wanted to signal peaceful intention. She was in her mid-40s, Elias estimated, dressed in professional clothes that suggested law enforcement or prosecution, her eyes scanning the park with practiced efficiency before settling on him with recognition that was instantaneous and certain. She sat on the opposite end of his bench without preamble, maintaining enough distance to respect personal space, while close enough for quiet conversation. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carrying the particular quality of respect mixed with curiosity. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Reeves, FBI Human Trafficking Task Force. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Elias lowered his newspaper, studying her with the attention he gave to all new contacts, body language, micro-expressions, the 1,000 small tells that separated genuine alliance from strategic deception. She met his gaze steadily, no discomfort with being assessed, and he saw in her eyes the particular weariness that came from working cases where the victims were often children and the perpetrators operated with resources and sophistication that made prosecution difficult and justice uncertain. "Your evidence intersected with an operation we've been running for 18 months, Reeves continued, pulling out a tablet that she angled so only he could see the screen. "Your surveillance of the Sacramento location connected dots we couldn't connect from our end. The trafficking network you've been watching is part of a larger operation spanning 5 states, with connections to international smuggling routes. Your documentation of the van and the specific individuals has given us leverage we desperately needed." The tablet showed maps and timelines, photographs of faces Elias recognized from his months of observation, a complex web of connections that illustrated how his single point of surveillance had intersected with a much vaster investigation. The children he had seen transferred through that service entrance were part of a pipeline, she explained, that moved victims from Mexico through California and into the interior United States, distributed to buyers whose anonymity was protected by layers of intermediaries and encrypted communications. The scope of what Reeves described was both validating and crushing. Validating because it proved Elias's instincts about the network's sophistication had been accurate. Crushing because it illustrated how vast the machinery of exploitation actually was. How his 11 months of work had exposed one node in a system that extended far beyond any single operation's capacity to dismantle. "The tactical operation scheduled for tomorrow night will target the Sacramento location," Reeves said, her voice dropping slightly, despite the ambient noise that made eavesdropping unlikely. "But we're simultaneously executing raids in 3 other cities, Portland, Las Vegas, and Phoenix, targeting facilities we believe are part of the same network. It's the largest coordinated action we've attempted against this particular organization, and your evidence provided the final pieces we needed to convince federal prosecutors that we had sufficient cause to move forward. Without your work, we'd still be gathering intelligence and watching while the pipeline continued to operate." The words were meant as gratitude, Elias understood, but they also carried weight of expectation. His testimony would likely be needed, his methods scrutinized, his decision to operate independently without official authorization questioned by defense attorneys looking for procedural vulnerabilities to exploit. He had accepted these risks when he began, but accepting and experiencing were different things, and he felt the familiar tension between operational necessity and legal complexity. They talked for an hour, Reeves asking detailed questions about his observations and Elias providing context that couldn't be captured in reports or video evidence. The patterns of behavior he had noticed, the subtle indicators of security consciousness, his assessments of the individual's roles within the organization's hierarchy. She was thorough and professional, taking notes on her tablet with practiced efficiency, occasionally asking for clarification or additional detail. Elias found himself appreciating her approach. No judgment about his methods, no bureaucratic concern about jurisdictional boundaries, just focused attention on building the strongest possible case with the evidence available. When their conversation concluded, Reeves stood and extended her hand, her grip firm and her expression carrying genuine gratitude. "What you did matters, Mr. Vance. It matters more than you probably know. Those children, the ones you saw being transferred, we'll get them out tomorrow night. Because of you, we'll get them out." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "I know this work takes a toll. I know the cost of watching and waiting while bad things happen. For what it's worth, I think you made the right calls, even when they were impossible calls. Thank you for your service." She walked away before Elias could respond, disappearing into the park's afternoon flow, and he sat alone on his bench, feeling the weight of her words, settling into spaces that had been empty too long. The tactical operation occurred precisely at 2:17 the following morning, coordinated across 4 cities with military precision and overwhelming force, designed to prevent the network from communicating warnings or destroying evidence. Elias watched the news coverage from his Stockton apartment, the television showing aerial footage of the Sacramento building surrounded by federal vehicles and agents in tactical gear, the sanitized version of violence and rescue that the public was allowed to witness. The reporter spoke in excited tones about a major human trafficking bust, about children being rescued and suspects being apprehended, about the culmination of a lengthy investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies working in unprecedented coordination. No mention of a homeless man who had spent 11 months on a park bench. No acknowledgement of the surveillance that had provided the intelligence that made the operation possible. Just the official narrative of institutional success and organizational capability. Elias had expected nothing different. His role would remain classified, documented only in sealed files that would be opened decades from now if they were opened at all. Another ghost story in the vast collection of operations that official history couldn't acknowledge without revealing methods and capabilities that needed to remain secret to retain their utility. The television showed children being led out of the building wrapped in blankets, their faces blurred to protect privacy, and Elias felt something loosen in his chest. Relief mixed with sorrow, satisfaction mixed with rage at what they had endured during the hours between his surveillance and this rescue. 9 children total recovered from the Sacramento location, the reporter announced, ranging in age from 7 to 15, all being provided immediate medical attention and trauma counseling. 9, not 4, meaning there had been others already present when the children Elias had witnessed arrived, meaning his intelligence had saved more lives than he had directly observed. The mathematics of impact were always imperfect, he knew, impossible to fully calculate because every action rippled through systems in ways that couldn't be completely traced or measured. But 9 children would sleep tonight in facilities designed for healing rather than exploitation, would wake tomorrow to begin the long process of recovery rather than endure continued trauma, and that mathematical certainty justified 11 months of cold and calculated degradation in ways that no official commendation ever could. The news coverage continued, with details about the coordinated raids in other cities. 43 individuals arrested across 4 states, millions of dollars in assets seized. A trafficking network described as one of the most sophisticated ever prosecuted in the western United States. As dawn broke over Stockton, Elias powered down the television and sat in silence, feeling the familiar emptiness that followed completed operations, when purpose withdrew and left only the awareness of time past and costs paid that could never be fully recovered. His phone showed messages from David Chen, brief congratulations and a formal request for debriefing, and from Sarah Reeves, thanking him again and providing contact information if he needed anything. But there were no messages from the children, no acknowledgement from the lives he had impacted, because they would never know his name or his sacrifice, would perhaps never understand that their rescue had been enabled by an old man willing to become invisible in service of justice that operated too slowly and imperfectly, but remained the only machinery available for confronting evil that knew no such constraints. Elias thought about his career, about 40 years spent in shadows, building cases and gathering intelligence, about the operations that succeeded and the ones that failed, about the lives saved and the ones lost while observation proceeded toward action through bureaucratic channels that moved with deliberate slowness. He thought about the bench in Riverside Park, about whether it was empty now or occupied by some other person who truly was homeless rather than merely performing homelessness for operational purposes. He thought about visibility and invisibility, about how society constructed categories that determined whose suffering mattered and whose could be ignored, and how he had weaponized that deliberate blindness to protect those who society's attention had rendered vulnerable. The work was never finished. He knew with certainty, born of decades fighting battles that generated no headlines and left casualties that no one officially counted. Another network was already operating in another city. Another pipeline was already moving vulnerable people toward exploitation that would continue until someone noticed and cared enough to do something about it. The question that had haunted Elias through 40 years of classified service returned with renewed intensity. How many more operations did he have in him? How many more identities could he wear before the essential self became too fragmented to recover? How long could he continue doing work that required becoming nothing to protect those who were treated as nothing by the systems that should have shielded them? 68 years old, he thought again, looking at his hands that had held cameras and weapons and thermos filled with evidence. Hands that had built a career in shadows but still possessed capability and will even if the body protested with increasing volume. The answer came not from calculation, but from something deeper and more fundamental. He would continue because stopping meant accepting that horror could flourish unwatched, that children could disappear into machinery of exploitation, while those with ability to intervene chose comfort over conscience. He would continue because the work mattered more than his exhaustion, because invisible service was still service, because someone had to stand watch in the spaces between society's attention and its failures. Elias Vance rose from his chair as Sacramento's dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and promise, the homeless man who had commanded the Attorney General's intervention, now preparing to disappear again into whatever identity the next operation would require. The apartment would be abandoned, the laptop returned to its locked cabinet, the evidence of his existence here erased as thoroughly as he had erased his presence from Riverside Park. Somewhere in Sacramento, 9 children were beginning the long journey toward healing, their rescue the visible outcome of invisible sacrifice that would never be acknowledged in official records or public gratitude. And somewhere else, in another city whose name Elias didn't yet know, another network was operating, and another horror was unfolding that would eventually require someone willing to become nothing in order to protect everything that mattered. He walked toward the door of the safe house, with purpose renewed despite weariness, the old spy whose one phone call had proven that some debts transcend time and some legacies endure beyond forgetting, carrying forward into whatever came next the stubborn conviction that justice delayed was still worth pursuing, and that invisible guardians remained necessary in a world that preferred not to see the darkness they confronted on everyone's behalf.